Well, it's not going to be any surprise to anyone in the room if I say that we are living in difficult, the fancy word is fraught, which basically means burdened or overwhelming times. It won't come as a surprise to anyone in this room if I say, to quote a famous American, these are times that try men's, if he were around today, he would say men's and women's souls. And on top of that, I do not believe that there are any rational grounds at this particular moment for optimism. I believe that when you talk to adults, you should treat them like adults. And part of treating them like adults is not to patronize, not to condescend, not to act as if they are unable to absorb the truth. And I have to give happy talks with rainbows. If there were grounds to be optimistic, I would be the first to declare them. But I do not believe at this particular point there are rational grounds to be optimistic. The situation in Gaza is catastrophic, and in my opinion, it's quite possible that it's crossed the line of no return. That, I believe, is possible. Now, it might be asked, if there's no grounds for optimism, then why should one persevere? It would seem to be a pointless exercise. But I think there are at least 3 solid reasons for persevering. Number 1, nobody can predict with certainty the future. Surprises happen. There isn't a proverb that it's always darkest before the dawn. So there's always the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility that there will be a turnaround and my dire forecasts will prove to be wrong. Number 2, it is untrue that if we do nothing, then things will just continue on their course. That's not true. There's a simple iron rule in these particular moments. If you do nothing, things will get worse. They will not stay the same. If you do nothing, if you don't exert yourself at all, the other side has an insatiable hunger for more power, more wealth, and they will keep taking more. As the expression has it, the hunger increases with each bite. So if we do nothing, bad as things seem right now, they will be much worse. Number 3, or the third reason, in my opinion, why we should continue is because it's the right thing to do. Some of you, probably all of you, are familiar with the Chinese sage Confucius, and it was famously said of Confucius that he persevered in the face of the knowledge that it was hopeless. Now, that might sound irrational, but being that we are human beings, which is to say, not computers or simply reasoning machines, it's not irrational to persevere in the face of the knowledge that it's hopeless. Because part of our being, B-E-I-N-G, part of our being cannot do nothing in the face of the horrors that have been inflicted on so many. Your being revolts, goes into revolt, in the knowledge that you're just sitting there doing nothing as a people is being systematically, methodically, in real time, on the screen, being wiped out. So, in order to live with yourself, you continue to labor, you continue to persevere, even as a part of you believes that it's hopeless. If I just might briefly go back to the second point, namely, things get worse. They don't stabilize, they get worse if you do nothing. There was a famous pacifist named E.J. Musty, and he said, the problem with war is the victor is convinced that violence works. The victor is convinced that violence works. And after 16 months now, there are many Israelis who have become convinced that violence works. And that bodes very badly for the West Bank, for parts of Lebanon, and who can calculate where else. So that's another reason, or a supplementary reason, why even if the situation has become irreversible in Gaza, there are still ample grounds to keep persevering, because Israel, in a celebratory mood, has now convinced itself each time a Gazan returns to his or her home in North Gaza, discovers there's nothing there. It's just a parking lot. And he or she, who with exhilaration went to the north, suddenly turns around in despair and goes back to the south looking for the tent in which he or she had lived for the past 16 or less months. Normally I would leave those remarks for the end, but I decided today to begin with those remarks so as to simply establish where I personally stand on how to go forward. I do not look at any news. I do not look at any videos. I do not look at any pictures from that part of the world, because that, at least in my own case, makes me completely demoralized and despairing. I want to continue, I want to persevere, so I just pursue my course regardless of what's going on. Now, In the time that remains, and I'm going to scrupulously watch you because I have the problem with making a flight. In the time that remains, I want to do basically two things. First of all, in the case of what's happened in Gaza over the past 16 months, there are two aspects, in my opinion, two aspects. One is the factual record. What happened in Gaza? And number two, there are real moral questions that Gaza raises about what's happened. These are, in my opinion, legitimate questions, which are matters of judgment. And when it comes to matters of judgment, people should be reasonable enough to agree to disagree. So I may render some judgments which people in this room or in our society broadly may not agree with, but I think there should be grounds for disagreement. However, I do not believe, I emphatically do not believe that there is any real controversy about what has happened in Gaza beginning October 8th. I do not believe that any reasonable person reading the documentary record as it has been assembled by the leading human rights organizations in the world, be it Amnesty International, which concluded a 250-page report on the events after October 7th. They concluded that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza, be it the UN Commission of Inquiry, which was headed by Navi Pillay, the South African lawyer and former human rights chief in the UN, which concluded that Israel was committing acts of extermination in Gaza, which includes Human Rights Watch, which concluded that Israel was committing acts of extermination and genocide in Gaza, which includes literally every major human rights and humanitarian organization in the world, which reached the same conclusions. It is not, and I will repeat, it is not a complicated question. It is not a controversial question that when you, as Human Rights Watch documented, when you systematically deny, deprive a captured population of water, when you systematically deny it food, when you systematically deny it fuel and electricity, when you, as has been copiously documented, when you target wastewater and sanitation facilities, when you target hospitals, when you systematically pulverize universities, when you target, as has been documented, when you target the skulls and chests of children, I do not believe And let's leave the I aside. I don't believe any rational person looking at the documentary record can possibly conclude anything other than Israel has been and continues to carry out a genocide in Gaza. That's the factual record. Now, there is a second aspect to that factual record, which, to my knowledge, has been kept in the dark. And that fact is, there are a large number of researchers who have simply collected the statements by Israeli officials from the top to the bottom of the political ladder, from one end of the political spectrum to the other end of the political spectrum. Statements from across Israeli civil society, television commentators, musicians, writers, and these collections of statements can fill and do fill. They fill hundreds of pages. It's absolutely breathtaking. If you doubt my word, as you should, question authority. Never take a person at his or her word unless he or she has established a real track record. And then, of course, you attach more value to that person's statement, but even he or she could be exaggerating or downright lying. So for those of you who are conscientious, you can look at the collection by Lee Mordechai, Mordechai. He's a Princeton-trained historian. He teaches at Hebrew University. He teaches Byzantine studies. He assembled this very thick collection of statements by Israelis. Or you can look at the submission, it's called a letter to the Security Council from South Africa. It's 121 pages, single space. It was May 29th, I think it was submitted to the UN Security Council. It's absolutely mind-numbing. One genocidal statement after another genocidal statement after another genocidal statement after another. So here's the thing. Israel, if you look at what they write in their newspapers, what they post on Facebook, what they tweet, what they say on public affairs, radio, and TV programs, they aren't in the least hiding the fact that they're committing genocide. They are proud of it. They are boasting about it. They relish it. They mock every child, woman, and men killed. I find it personally disgusting the way there's this distinction between women and children killed versus men killed, as if every man is a deserving target in Gaza. We should never use that phrase. It's not just women and children. The men don't deserve to live in Gaza. They boast about the homes they destroy. They take videos of the universities they pulverize. They relish and mock the dead as they take their bulldozers, not just to bulldoze homes, but to roll over the bodies that they have killed. So, it's not as if we're relying, even though it's enough, it's not as if we're just relying on the human rights organizations. It's not just as if we're relying only on what the World Health Organization has to say, what UNESCO has to say, what UNICEF has to say, what CARE has to say, what Save the Children has to say, and on and on and on. I said, and I repeat, every humanitarian organization is saying the same thing about what's going on or has gone on in Gaza. It is not controversial. But even if there were, even for argument's sake, even if there were doubt about it, maybe they're all anti-Semitic. Maybe CARE is anti-Semitic, and maybe UNICEF is anti-Semitic, and maybe this organization is anti-Semitic, and that organization. Okay, maybe that's true, for argument's sake. But then how do you explain all the statements that are made by the senior government officials, by the most influential figures in Israeli civil society? There are times when it's warranted, it's justified to make the distinction between the state and society. Because there are times when the state does not accurately represent the feelings, the sentiments of society in general. I am old enough to have lived through the Vietnam War in my country. And there was a period, you could say during the height of the Vietnam War, where the actions of our state, our government, did not reflect the feelings and sentiments of a large part of our society. However, that cannot, and I don't say this gleefully, I don't say it happily, but that cannot be said of what's happened in the past 16 months. The destruction, the extermination, the genocide in Gaza is not a state project, it's a national project. The entire Israeli society, with its eyes open, with clear presence of mind, with full knowledge of what's going on. They see it in those Facebook postings, they see it in the tweets, they see it everywhere, in the full knowledge of what's going on. They have reached a consensus that it must be that by the end of this conflict, Gaza will be no more. That's the consensus. It's not just Mr. Netanyahu or the former defense minister, Mr. Gallant. Now, some people like to say it's the far right, one of those favorite expressions, the far right, Mr. Smotrich and Mr. Ben-Gvir. No. First of all, the whole country is the far right. There is no far right. And across the board, from one end of the political spectrum to the other, and from the top to the bottom, it's a national project to, for once and for all, liquidate Gaza. That's the factual side, and I feel very confident in rendering that judgment based on having spent the past 16 months, day in and day out, reading one more document, one more report, large reports on what's happened in Gaza. But then there are two moral questions, which I believe are more complicated. The two moral questions you might call, for those of you who watch YouTube, you might call them the Piers Morgan questions. And for the past 16 months, Piers Morgan has been drilling every guest, in particular those guests who don't want to join the genocide bandwagon. He's been asking two questions. Unlike others, I think those are the right questions. Unlike others, I think those are tough questions. Unlike others, I had to think hard and mentally sweat a lot trying to find my way. The first question is, for those of you who watch him, he's now, I'm sorry to say, a lick-spittle Trump sycophant, a groveling lick-spittle Trump sycophant, a pathetic sight to behold, knowing full well that the way to, as the woman Ms. Dixon said before, the path to the proximity to power is to massage his ego. In any case, that's an aside. In any event, the first question is, obviously, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? I think honest people will acknowledge that's not an easy question. And it took me quite a long time to figure out how to answer that question. I knew instinctively, intuitively, I could not condemn what Hamas did. Not because I'm some flaming radical or some lunatic jihadi. The reason I couldn't condemn it was because I had spent the past 15 years chronicling what had been done to the people of Gaza and where they stood on October 6th. In the face of that knowledge, something told me I couldn't condemn. So, what am I referring to? I'm going to have to be very brief because of time. Can you tell me where we stand? Yeah. I have to use telegraphic language at this point. The simple fact is that from 1948 forward, when Gaza became Gaza in 1948, from 1948 forward, every time, and I should clarify for younger people in the room, Gaza was under Egyptian administrative control from 1948 to 1967. In 1967, it came under Israeli control. But there's one common denominator between both of those experiences, Egyptian and then Israeli. The common denominator was every outside observer who came to Gaza walked away describing it as a concentration camp. That's true of UN officials in the 1950s. That's true for the older people in the room, the father of our former presidential candidate, Al Gore. Al Gore's father went to visit Gaza. His father was also a senator. He went to visit Gaza right after Israel conquered it. He went before Congress and he says Gaza is a huge concentration camp. In 2004, the head of Israel's National Security Council, the equivalent of our head of the CIA, he wrote, quote, Gaza is a huge concentration camp. Every observer coming to Gaza walked away with the same mental image. For those of you who are unaware, half the inmates of that concentration camp are children. When you look at this young man sitting here, this young man sitting here, those constitute, imagine this room where half children, from here to there, down the middle to the end, children. That's Gaza. And all of them were born into a concentration camp. But that's only, I'm sorry to say, that's only the beginning. Because beginning in 2006, Israel imposed this brutal blockade on Gaza. A blockade where they prohibited chocolate from entering Gaza. They prohibited baby chicks from entering Gaza. They prohibited potato chips from entering Gaza. The list of the things they prohibited was so long that they finally decided to just compose a list of what can enter Gaza. So we have a concentration camp compounded by a brutal medieval criminal siege of Gaza. And then, for those of you in this room who are old enough to remember, because bear in mind, the video you watched of me is already 20 years ago. Since then, Israel periodically launches its high-tech killing sprees in Gaza. Some of you will remember the names. 2008-9, Operation Protective Edge. 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense. 2014, Operation Protective Edge. During Protective Edge, the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, he took a tour of Gaza after what Israel did in Protective Edge. And he commented, quote, "In all my professional life, I have never seen such destruction as I saw in Gaza. In all my professional life, a person whose entire resume consists of visiting combat zones." He said, "I've never seen such destruction as I saw in Gaza." Now guess what? You ready for this? During Operation Protective Edge, there were 2.5 million tons of rubble left behind. 2.5. Sounds terrible, right? Sounds horrible, right? Sounds ghastly, right? Leaves you aghast, right? Did to me. But the estimate now is that Israel, as of this moment, has left behind 50 million tons of rubble, 20 times protective edge, when Peter Morris said, "I've never seen destruction like this ever before." In protective edge, 18,000 homes were destroyed or severely damaged. You know what the figure is now? About 300,000. 92% of the homes in Gaza, 92% have been damaged or destroyed. 92%, that's quite an achievement. No wonder the Israelis are so happy. That's a pretty impressive achievement. So, that's what Gaza was. A concentration camp compounded by a medieval siege, compounded by the periodic killing sprees. And truth be told, the world had forgotten about Gaza by October 6th. All the talk in the town was about the Abraham Accords and whether the Saudis would join. And it looked to the people of Gaza like the whole regional conflict was going to be solved over their heads. 60% of the young people in Gaza were unemployed. All they had to look forward to each day for their entire lives, because most of them were born after the siege was imposed in 2006. So those young men in Gaza who burst its gates on October 7th, burst the gates of the concentration camp. Those young men, they were born into a concentration camp. It's 26 miles long, the length of a marathon, 5 miles wide. All they had to look forward to each day was to pace the perimeter of the concentration camp. They had no past, they had no present, they had no future. They were born into a concentration camp. They languished in that concentration camp. And as of October 6th, they were destined to die in it. In the face of those facts, it seems to me that one can, even though it might sound contradictory, one can say simultaneously that horrors occurred on October 7th. I do not believe in the current state of our knowledge it can be disputed that Hamas committed mass atrocities on October 7th. I believe you can acknowledge that fact, but simultaneously say, I refuse to condemn those who carried out those acts because they were given no choice, no option, except to be born into, to languish in, and to die in that concentration camp. There's more to say in that topic, but time doesn't allow me. I got the 1-minute hook, for which I'm grateful because he's doing, I'm being done a favor to keep on schedule. I want to just leave on one other question. The second question by Mr. Pierce Morgan has always been, but Israel had to do something. And doesn't Israel have the right to self-defense? You couldn't really expect that Israel would do nothing after the atrocities of October 7th. And that, too, is not an easy question to answer, and I had to ponder it at some length. And here I'll just end on an analogy, and you decide for yourselves whether the analogy works for you. For younger people in this room who spend too much time on the computer and not enough time reading books, an analogy is a comparison. Okay? So, though I suspect you knew what analogy was. Yes. You look like a bright young man. You too look bright. A little too much time on the web. So, here is the analogy. There is a battered woman. Her husband batters her and batters her and batters her, day in and day out, tormented, agonizing screams, agonizing shrieks, hoping a passerby, a neighbor, will do something to rescue her from her condition. The neighbors hear the shrieks. They hear the torments. They know what's going on, but they do nothing. The woman finally summons the courage to call the police. The police come, they investigate, they find evidence, they find voluminous, that means a lot, it's a big word. They find voluminous evidence. They write up a report, just like all those UN reports over the past 20 years that have been written up on Gaza. They write a report and they find that the woman is being battered and tormented and the husband is engaging in criminal activity, just like the UN reports found about Israel's periodic killing sprees in Gaza. They present the report to the district attorney. He takes it, puts it in a desk drawer, and it just collects dust. Just like all those UN reports, which collect dust at the UN and collect dust on my bookshelves. And then finally, the man is approaching her again, her spouse. He's about to beat her again, torture her again. She grabs a kitchen knife and she stabs him. And she stabs him a second time. And she stabs him a third time. At this point, he grabs his pistol, he shoots her, and kills her. Now, the way our law is constructed, were he brought to court, as several of the lawyers in this room could probably attest, he would almost certainly be acquitted on the grounds of self-defense, that he had the right to self-defense, he had the right to kill her. But I ask you, as a moral judgment, did he have the right to kill her in self-defense? Or after having tormented and tortured her for 20 years, he had forfeited his right to self-defense. He had no right of self-defense after what he had done. Thank you.